Over the years, the media has been a source of information, education, and entertainment. An Irish-British commander, Sir Charles McCarthy, introduced the first newspaper in 1822 in the Gold Coast. The Royal Gold Coast Gazette and Commercial Intelligencer, launched by McCarthy, were handwritten but failed to survive after his death in the Battle of Insamankwa between the Fantis and the Asantes. Following his initiative, Charles Bannerman also established the Accra Herald in 1857, with its first publication released in 1858, also handwritten. In the quest for independence, the newspaper was used to create awareness and call for action against the colonial government. The colonialists reacted by introducing harsh laws to curtail media operations.
Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
Nkrumah's reign was in the First Republic. After Nkrumah became the president, his newspaper, the Accra Evening News, dominated all other newspapers. He declared Ghana a one-party state and had total control of the state-owned media. Nkrumah became a dictator and clamped down on all those against his motives. He became vindictive to others and harassed the private media because they were against his ideology. This led to the shutdown of the Ashanti Pioneer and the detainment of its editor. In 1958, Nkrumah enacted the Preventive Detention Act to help bring an end to the violence and tension. In 1959, he came out with the False Report Act and Sedition Act. This False Report Act was meant to detain journalists or reporters who reported falsely. They were given a jail term of 15 years without trial. The Sedition Act also guaranteed that a person who will accuse a public officer for being reckless in performing his duty will be jailed for 5 years without trial. In 1960, he enacted another law which was directed to the media, the Criminal Code Law. It imposed press censorship. He required Daily Graphic not to engage in any activity that had any capability of bringing public destruction or creating an environment which is full of fear. In 1963, he came up with a Newspaper Licensing Act. This required that anyone who wanted to operate a newspaper get a license which is to be renewed every year. So many people turned against Nkrumah, which led to his overthrow when he left the country for a national assignment in Hanoi.
The most important thing is that under Nkrumah, there was a deliberate and purposeful effort to create a media which would enhance the African dignity. Ghana News Agency, for example, was created in order to tell the African story, the African success story. So it was biased in favor of the African. The Institute of Journalism was established to train journalists who would tell the African story and help the African overcome years of racist oppression and so on. So that was the central thrust of policy and so on. You understand? Of course, under Buzia, it was totally different. The government's commitment was to denationalize everything. Just the same as the NPP today, making private sector the so-called engine of development and growth and so on. So the media tended to promote private sector development. The media was not that enthusiastic about African liberation as official policy. It was also to make sure that we decoupled from the metropolitan countries, that we were able to produce the things that we needed, that we consumed the things that we produced, and that we became African in our outlook and everything. So that was the media project immediately after independence. Well, the colonial government was very hostile to all the anti-colonial movements and their organs, not just in Ghana, everywhere. I mean, governments don't like rebellion. Governments try to clamp down on dissent and so on. And it was the same in the colonial era. I mean, it was not just the Accra Evening News all the other organs. I think there was one called the Sentinel and so on. All of them were repressed by the colonial authorities.
Oh, okay.
And people were jailed for sedition. There were people like Jimmy Markham and others who were jailed for sedition under the colonial administration. So definitely had an impact on them. There's a famous case in which A.K. Deku, who became part of the 1966 school, took Nkrumah to court, I think for libel or defamation, whatever. There were damages, and all of that affected the media and its work. In all situations, they are likely to have pro-government media houses and anti-government media houses. This notion of media independence and media neutrality doesn't exist in the real world. Like today, as we sit here, there are journalists who believe that whatever Nana Akufo-Addo is doing is correct. There are others who think that what he's doing is wrong, and so on. That is how society is. So in the days of Nkrumah, it was that there were journalists who agreed with his program, and there were journalists who disagreed with his program. Okay? There was some level of terrorism, massive level of terrorism under Nkrumah. His house was bombed. School children who were going for meetings at the sports stadium were bombed and so on. Many people were killed. There were several assassination attempts on him and so on. You understand? So if the society was that divided, it was polarized. There was terrorism, there was violence and so on. You had journalists on both sides. And the fact of being journalists does not exclude us from our responsibilities. If you support terrorism, you'll be dealt with as a terrorist. You understand? Right now, in several countries, including the United Kingdom and in America and so on, they've passed laws like the Patriot Law, which enables government to arrest and detain people without trial or charge. You know, if they are associated or deemed to be associated or suspected to be associated with terrorism. The same situation happened in Ghana. You know, so I think that it's important that we put things in proper context.
All the radio stations, television stations, singular, and newspapers that operated in the First Republic were state-owned, government-owned, in other words. So that you had the Daily Graphic, you had the Mirror, which now belong to the stables of the graphic communications. And then you had the Ghanaian Times and Spectator that belonged to the New Times Corporation, state-owned. You did have the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation that had GBC 1 was radio, GBC 2 was radio. 1 was in all the 5 Ghanaian languages, Ga, Ewe, Nzema, Dagbani, Hausa, Akan. Akan included Asante Twi, Ekuapem Twi, and Fanti Twi. Then you had GBC 2 that aired in English language. And then you had external service of Radio Ghana that was English largely, and at times Hausa that broadcast beyond Ghana to the West African sub-region, including Nigeria, name them, Liberia, what have you. They were essentially state-owned and by import also government-owned. They were controlled. So insofar as you publish things that were in favor of the government, you had your air, you had your audience, you had your readership. If he didn't even dare in the first place to criticize government because it wouldn't see the light of day. If you wrote an article or a letter to the editor that was critical of the Nkrumah government, it would be thrown out. You even raise the chance of being traced and then even being apprehended. So that was it. Of course, there were merits. The media was at that time supposed to be for development. You were talking of development journalism, where you talk about how to develop and also positive things. But it did have its huge disadvantage because then you didn't have the other side of the matter. You didn't have divergent views. You didn't have criticism that is also important for the socio-economic development of the country.
After overthrowing the presumed dictator, the NLC, with the intention of providing libertarian press, released imprisoned journalists and lifted censorship laws instituted by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. The new regime sought to encourage constructive criticisms and allowed free flow of information in order to create a stable relationship between the press and the government. Notwithstanding this supposed freedom, a ban was placed on foreign journalists. General Ankara, chairman of the NLC, was later replaced by Lieutenant General Akwesi Amankwa Efrifa in April 1969. The new chairman formed a three-man presidential commission which paved way for a general election in 1969, which brought into power the Progress Party led by Dr. Ebrifa Busia as Prime Minister and Edward Akufo-Addo as ceremonial president. The Second Republic, led by Dr. Busia, repealed various media laws instituted by its predecessor. With press freedom curtailed, the Prime Minister dismissed the editor of Daily Graphic, Cameron Dodu, after he had criticized the government's call for an African dialogue with the apartheid South African government. After almost 3 years in office, Dr. Busia was overthrown in a coup led by General Ignatius Echampong in the National Redemption Council on 13 January 1972.
What are you going to do now? Are you going to fly back to Accra?
I am not saying what I'm going to do, except that I will not let my people down, and they will soon know my next move.
Do you feel there's any chance at all that this military coup will in the end be successful or not?
I have no doubt that it will fail.
Do you feel very depressed tonight?
I am sad. I am sad because I can think of the tragedy this would be for Africa, and particularly for Ghana. And that, of course, makes me sad. But I'm not depressed in the sense that I have no faith or confidence in eventual victory. We shall win through.
General Echampong's regime was characterized by the prioritization of the state-owned media. The private media, on the other hand, was subjected to various forms of harassment. In 1978, he was overthrown in palace coup and replaced by General F.W.K. Ekufu. With the intention of restoring democracy, General Ekufu gave way for the establishment of two-party newspapers, The Star by the PFP and The Gongong by the PNP. However, his reign was short-lived. In June 1979, the SMC-2 was overthrown by Armed Forces Revolutionary Council led by Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlins, which paved way for the Third Republic.
We of the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, during our short stay in power, have demonstrated openly what many people had only suspected before, namely, that holding of office in government in this country had in almost all cases been used to plunder the wealth of the nation. Ghana is looking up to you. Thank you.
The Third Republic, under Dr. Hile Liman, established a press commission of 12 members to scrutinize media operations in the country. However, the press commission was dissolved after the overthrow of Dr. Liman by Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlins under the Provisional National Defense Council.
The AFRC, for example, virtually decided that in order to be able to advance the reasons why they overthrew the government of the Akufo government, the military government, the military dictatorship, the military junta, was to let Ghanaians understand that they were corrupt, they were abuse of fundamental human rights, that Ghana was in the depth of destruction, and that the coup was a necessary evil. And before they could do that, then they need to have a very vibrant media who will be able to, because at that time, issues of coup and the rest was being frowned upon by the international community. Democracy have started coming up. Agitations in the Western world against dictators of the world, Idi Amin and the rest were being targeted. And also there was agitation for democratic governance in Eastern Europe. There was agitation against the then Soviet Union, that it wasn't a democratic environment. So the glasnost and the perestroika and things were coming up. Then East Germany was suffering, Poland, then Czechoslovakia, then Yugoslavia, and all those things were going through transitions. Agitations were good. So when the Liman government came in, there was a need for Liman government to flow. And I think they saw in the then press commission, or media, in the form of media commission, a sort of licensing regime or an institution or a structure that people could interpret to mean that they were suppressing press freedom. So I believe that the idea of the Liman government at that time was to create an environment that will not give cause for anyone to think that they are censoring media freedom and then also freedom of information. That's what I believe. But a lot of people have their own thoughts about that action because they thought that it was an attempt to stifle press freedom by the Liman regime. I'm yet to be convinced that that was, because I didn't see President Hilal Liman as someone who intentionally tried to suppress press freedom, because he was a true Democrat. PNDC government really needed to take that action because Liman was not willing to do that. Liman thought that it was important to have people to look at how the media will conduct itself, how we can have the roadmap towards media pluralism. And since the PNDC government had come as a military government, they need to stabilize themselves, because they came at a time when there was something like unattractive environment for coups. They came at a time when the world was moving towards democratic governance. And so if they should allow that media institution to stay, they could be used against them. And so to stabilize themselves and to give themselves some stability, there's a need for them to make sure that all those structures, all those institutions that could be used to oppose them are dealt with. It was looking at the circumstance of the time, it was the right thing for them to do. The only way they can do it is a new government that has come in, and they need to assert themselves. And if there is this structure or this institution that is going to create the environment to make them unpopular, the only thing they could do at that time was to make sure they dissolve that institution.
After Rawlings dissolved the 12-member press commission and instituted some oppressive laws which summoned the media to promote issues of the PNDC, some prominent journalists were arrested. He established the Interim Management Committee and had total control over the state-owned media.
When I was given the appointment as the PNDC Secretary for Information, I felt that the media should not necessarily be enemies of a regime, but it should place itself in a position where it can critique what the regime is doing. Now, critiquing does not mean always being negatively critical. That's what we think, that the media must necessarily be either fawning and sycophanting or being rabid antagonists. I think we must draw a midpoint, because after all, what is the media supposed to do? It's supposed to present the people with information. That's what media is supposed to do. It's supposed to present the citizens with information, and you don't have to be an antagonist all the time against a regime, because you should see things from the perspective of what is it that the people need to know so that they too can serve as good citizens of the land, but bold enough to criticize the government if it should do so. During the PNDC, and even in other regimes, during the PNDC, it was quite difficult, and those who were very strongly critical, had difficulties. Some of them spent time in jail for criticizing. It was tough. It wasn't easy.
Under a military regime, there are so many things that are restricted because the broadcasting or the public broadcaster, which is GBC, is under the government. And so it's very difficult to say things, do things, play music of a certain kind, which you're not allowed to. So there was virtually a very, very high level of control. And so you needed to be very, very careful of what you said, the kind of music that you played, the kind of people that you spoke to. I mean, it was a revolutionary period. And so once you're under that kind of regime, you are sort of like suppressed, as far as talent is concerned. And those were some of the hindrances that we went through in GBC.
Later, there was a call for democratic governance by Professor Boahene, Akufo-Addo, and other influential politicians. Rawlings was also being pressured by the international bodies, as Ghana was refused foreign aid because it was headed by a military leader. That led him to transit into democratic governance, which created the Fourth Republic. The Fourth Republic is characterized by press freedom. Its beginning had some libel laws, which was aimed at controlling slandering and sensational reportage.
Under the PNDC regime, it is kind of pretty difficult to talk about that, until it was sent to Parliament under the democratic regime. All these themes came up, but then it was difficult to, take somebody to court under the libel law at the time. It was who what and how strings were pulled. It was something that was in the offing and people were very, very careful about. Again, the bottom line is what you say, how you say, why you said it, and its total relevance. And so you just had to be very, very careful.
I think that for some of them, they have taken the freedom to be licensed. There's a distinction between having freedom and having license. License to do wrong. License, you can use the license to do good, but you can use your freedom also almost as a license to do what is wrong. I don't think it's the repealing of the libel law that has led to some of the aberrations within the media. I think that perhaps it is the proliferation of people in the media space, some who see the digital divide that we have more as a means like radio and television, maybe as a very effective tool for being political antagonists. You see, but as I said, the media is not only for partisan politics, but for politics in general, which should mean the art of running a country, the art of governing is what you should see politics as, So it isn't just party politics. It's not just partisan politics, party A, party B, party C, party D, no. But the body politic is the whole of the citizenry. So how does the media inform the citizenry about things that they need to know about the way governance is going on so that the citizens can take decisions and perhaps make right choices when it comes to the time of voting? During the time of any regime, what are the things that should be brought to the fore? Where you need to applaud the government or where you need to tell the government, no, this is not the way it needs to be because many people will not benefit from the decisions and so on. Are we charting the right path? I think that is by way of information. Now, naturally, when you inform people, you need to get their feedback. So even analyzing the kind of feedback you get And making these available to those who are governing is also an important part of media work. It comes into the public space, but it's okay. If it is a feedback from people, then every government should be happy to hear about the feedback, because I don't think any government sets itself to really do bad things for its citizens. I don't think so. So I think every government needs to know what the people think, because you will use that as a means of making the things you do better. So I think that responsibility perhaps is not being used properly, because if all you do is perhaps insult people, really, you're no good to the citizens. You should discuss the issues, the merits and demerits of issues, and try and move away from attacking personalities. It's true, it's a person who does something you want to critique, but you can take the person aside, and not attack the person, but what the person is doing. I think there's a clear distinction. It's not even a fine line, it's a clear distinction. And I think these are some of the things that we need to do.
It got to a point where it was realized that the libel law was inhibiting the work of the media, in the sense that you mentioned the word libel, in the sense that journalists were going to jail because of the work they do. And the constitution of the country, that's the 1992 constitution, did not give journalists their freedom, and at the same time emphasize that they will be going to jail because of their work. So the MPP government, led by President Kufuor and the then Attorney General, who is the president now, repealed the libel law to allow journalists to practice freely. Even if criminal libel law were to be on the statute books, which it used to be, journalists were still accused of malpractices. Therefore, I do not think that it has anything to do with criminal libel law. I only think that journalists are not living up to the rules and regulations of the profession.
But I think in the fourth Republic, we've had very fantastic, way of celebrating the media. Of course, I think if you check your constitution, I think chapter 5 speaks about freedom of the media. So it tells you that, so far as we were even added to the constitution of this country, the 1992 constitution, it tells you what it was. The only restriction that prevented us was the censorship of stories and all that. Where you had the issue of defamation and all those things being taken to court. And I think I remember in the era of Kufuor, right after Rawlings, that thing was eliminated by then Attorney General, now the President. The criminal libel law was taken off. So it allowed the emergence of good neutralism, objectivity, much investigations being done and all that. So for me, I think from that era, from second, third, I think the most enjoyable time for me is the fourth era. Because if you remember, if I take you back a little, even within 1992s, 90s, where you find our old people, our old veterans now, Kokubakos, the Harunatas, the Kosi Prats and all that, had serious challenges with government in power. A typical example is their issues with Rawlings. Even before Rawlings, Kokubako them suffered, so many prison cases, Ben F. Singh doing stories about Rawlings, being arrested, put into jail without even any announcement and all that. But this time, it is not like that. We are enjoying that massive support from the people. I think we are doing much in mirroring what the people's problems, challenges that they have. We are mirroring it very well. I think that the fourth is much, much better.
In 2001, the libel law was repealed under the NPP government to provide enough press freedom to enhance the role of the media as the fourth estate.